The fun in visiting these villages is trying to imagine the life that pulsed through them.
What's always interesting to me is, what were people eating? Well, they weren't slurping down spaghetti or corn or potatoes, not even chocolate, coffee, tea, rice, or tomatoes. Those things arrived in Europe centuries later. Instead, the medieval housewife, say the wife of a successful merchant, headed to the market every day. Remember, there was no refrigeration.
In Aix-en-Provence, a medieval housewife might still find her way. Centuries ago, she was picking over live chickens and ducks, live fish and eels swimming in water barrels, salted beef, meat-filled pastries, cheese, wine, oil, and bread. Not a bad selection.
Saucisson de Salier, please.
Look at it.
Bon.
Turn it up.
She added flavors from her own kitchen garden with onions, leeks, greens, herbs like basil, sage, and parsley, and fruits like apples and pears. She sprinkled flower petals in stews and salads, daylilies, lavenders, peonies, marigolds, and sunflowers. If the lady had extra pennies, she splurged on spices brought in from the mysterious East.
It's a tradition as old as the villages of Provence. Once a week, every village, no matter how large or small, has an outdoor market. Try to find out when it is. Most guidebooks will tell you, or ask any local.
Now, on to Italia. If high energy Italy is your dream destination, believe it or not, there are places to get away. Florence, however, is not one of them. Wandering here is like floating in an overwhelming time warp with the awesome Renaissance halting you at every turn. I love it. However, a wander down narrow streets or along the Ponte Vecchio offers no hint of escape. To complicate matters, the nearby medieval hill towns of Tuscany bulge with tourists much of the summer. There's a reason. They're magic towns. So how do you find Italy's magic without feeling trampled? Take heart. This is when you rent a car. And if you're bullish on avoiding crowds, drive past and beyond the big-name hill towns. The provinces of Tuscany and Umbria are breathtakingly rural, historic, and abundant. Part of the magic is discovering a village on your own. Just south of Siena lies the region of Valdorcia. One look at the lush vineyards and you feel wine tasting in the air. The upscale wine Brunello di Montalcino is the pride of the fortified town. Castello Bonfi Winery, once an 11th century fortress, sits on 7,000 acres high above Montalcino and provides a full range of Tuscan wines. Both Brunello and Chianti wines stem from the Sangiovese grape. In Tuscany, you can tour a winery at almost every turn, and it's a lively way to learn about wine and to meet locals.
In fact, the name of Sangiovese means blood of Zeus.
Of Zeus?
Zeus.
I did not know that Sangiovese meant blood of Zeus.
Yeah.
Naturally, food tasting goes along with wine tasting. One must always make time for a Tuscan meal.
Thank you so much for having me. Castello Bonfi.
As you've noticed, the roads less traveled are no longer the secret of a few savvy explorers. More and more tourists are asking locals for advice. They plan with care, seek out the back roads, and they're discovering the richness of Europe's past. They've found Orvieto, for example, halfway between Florence and Rome at 1,000 feet up. They come for the ancient walls, medieval character, and a startling cathedral facade of marble and mosaic. These sites touch the surface of the region's culture and lead to quieter places. For me, a light bulb went off underneath Orvieto, in the ruins of an ancient city, Velsna or Volcini. The Etruscan haunt goes back to the 7th century BC. In this netherworld, you really do grasp how civilizations are layered on top of each other. Which triggers us to head southwest of Orvieto to a string of less traveled hill towns, and my favorite, Pitigliano. These old settlements are nestled into the hills of steep volcanic tufa rock characteristic of South Tuscany. Walking the streets in Pitigliano, you're swept way into the past. Nearby cave tombs give evidence of Etruscan settlements dating to several centuries before Christ. Then Pitigliano was nicknamed Little Jerusalem because of a vibrant, large Jewish community that once existed here, migrating from Rome as early as the 1400s. At dusk, Pitigliano and its neighbors, such as the well-fortified Serrano, appear to float up and out over the rocky hillsides. They're ideal spots for wandering, musing on events that passed here, and enjoying your precious downtime.
Oh, grazie.
South Tuscany shines among images of Europe's great getaways. We've barely touched on our travel escapes for catching your breath all over Europe. There are the bucolic getaways in the English countryside, and the awesome hilltop ruins of Sicily. That isolated Greek beach, and the hidden villas are still calling. Not to mention France's Loire Valley, cradling acres of Renaissance castles and gardens.
True, travelers before us found many of Europe's tranquil places, medieval hill towns, hidden forest trails, blue water coves. Also true, countless such discoveries are no longer secret, but there are others. With a bit of adventure, a word from locals, and time for the quest, we'll find our getaways with no traffic and no tourist hassle.
Europe is famous for historic sites, the remarkable clues that let us speculate on how people lived centuries ago. In Italy, travelers can picnic in the shadow of a medieval tower and almost hear the clank of chains. In old churches, they see stunning frescoes and statues, figures geometrically grouped, rigid and symbolic, medieval, flat. And then, at some point, they're struck with a pronounced change in the art. They find themselves staring at a real likeness, a face filled with grief or joy, a figure stooped, or a muscled torso, or fresco drawing them into its depth. Such grace could be classic Greek or Roman, but more likely, if they're in, say, Florence, they've spotted a piece of the Renaissance. This time, we look at Renaissance masterpieces and explore a bit of the rich legacy behind them. For a glimpse of that rich legacy, we start our tour in Rome. From Rome, we'll travel north through Italy, first to Florence, then to Venice and Milan, crossing into France's Loire Valley, and we'll cap our Renaissance trip near London at Hampton Court. Sightseeing in Rome, what an experience. The city's copycat architecture and sculpture illustrates how the Romans borrowed from the Greeks, but built larger. This is where the Renaissance comes in. The word literally means rebirth and refers to Italy's 15th century passion for reviving the ideals of the classical world, ancient Greece and Rome, from 500 BC to 500 AD. The art waited for almost 1,000 years to be lovingly rediscovered. No wonder the Renaissance artists trekked here by hook or crook to study these ancient ruins. Michelangelo is one of them. He was the 16th century sculptor and pride of Florence, but the church in Rome could not resist calling on his talents again and again and again. Michelangelo's favorite tool was the claw chisel, and only when coerced repeatedly by Pope Julius II did he reluctantly pick up a paintbrush and head for Rome to take on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel at the Vatican. Here he worked for 4 years, creating what came to be the most revered single fresco in the world. The story of the creation, God and Adam, the prophets and the seers, more than 600 figures of incredible proportion are presented in the awesome masterpiece. Recently cleaned and restored, the work's original color is believed to shine as vibrantly as it did in 1512. Once the Republic of Florence, this city is where the Renaissance began and flourished for more than 150 years.
In Florence, at almost every turn, you can run smack into the legacy of 15th and 16th century masterminds. Like never before in the Western world, new ideas in science, literature, and visual arts just skyrocketed. Against serious odds, the period was a gigantic experiment, a workshop, a festival of human achievement.
What propelled this new vision of the world out of the Middle Ages? A vision no longer mostly of saints and biblical figures and the trials of making it to heaven, but one that featured also human beings, people living earthly lives. Fortunately, the Middle Ages were not all dungeons and gloom. In the 1300s, after a recovery from the bubonic plague, Europe's agricultural and technical progress accelerated. Sea trade was booming, and eventually, the spread of wealth on the continent was greater than ever. By the mid-1400s, with the progress of the printing trade, educated middle classes had access to reading and writing. Students flocked to Italy to study the classics, than the big wide world seemed smaller. The church, the strongest and richest institution in Europe, was under fire. Voices uttered the question barely whispered 100 years earlier. Should the church have the power to govern people's civil lives as well as their spiritual lives?
By the 15th century, Florence was ripe for a cultural rebirth. Humanism was on the rise, and the city was rich. It sprang from a revival of the ideals of ancient Greece and Rome. Individual curiosity, the study of the arts, science, math, and philosophy, they all flourished.
The baptistry is the oldest building in Florence, breaking ground in the 11th century, and its treasures show us the shift from medieval to a modern view of the world. First, the medieval. Walk in and look up at the mosaic ceiling. Behold the depiction of the Last Judgment. A chilling panorama started in the 1200s. The figures are symbolic and fairly rigid. There's no quibbling about the theme. Depending on how one stacks up, he or she is waved off to a peaceful heaven or straight down to the howling monsters of hell. Now step outside to the baptistry doors, and voila, the Renaissance world awaits. The north doors of Lorenzo Ghiberti were a revelation, a breakthrough in 3D perspective. He began the work in 1403 and finished 20 years later. The critic Vasari called the doors absolutely perfect, seemingly breathed into shape rather than cast and polished with iron tools. It was no surprise then that in 1425, Ghiberti landed the job of making the east doors, which took another 27 years to finish. Michelangelo dubbed them the Gates of Paradise, which they are called today. Though not yet famous as an architect, Filippo Brunelleschi won the competition to invent and build a dome to cover the 150-foot octagonal span of the Florence Cathedral. No one else had any idea how to do this. But Brunelleschi's aptitude for precise calculation and his rampant imagination held the day. He would build an egg. He figured a way to use 8 arches raised like ribs that held a network of smaller ribs and connecting arches, forming an almost vertical pitch. Thus, the risk-taking Filippo Brunelleschi became the first great architect of the Italian Renaissance. No visitor to Florence can miss the mighty landmark that soars 308 feet into the air and tops one of Europe's largest cathedrals. Daring confidence was contagious in Florence's art scene. And yet a visit to the Bargello Museum shows why the unpretentious sculptor Donatello was central to the early Renaissance. He was amazingly original. If realism was a Renaissance battle cry, Donatello, or Little Donato, was the first great Renaissance warrior. His most loved work is the small bronze David, built in his older years. It stood in the courtyard of the Medici Palace, where a century later, a young Michelangelo could gaze upon it day after day. It was a rare prize. Nude male statues had been taboo for centuries. With his long ringlets and sun hat, to my eye, this gentle David resembles a 1960s flower child. And yet, he is Donatello's early Renaissance vision of the brave youth who only moments before had slain the giant Goliath.
These Renaissance headliners motivated each other, dead or alive. They were driven, gifted workhorses and master craftsmen. They learned philosophy and the anatomy of the human form. They went off to Rome to study the ruins of antiquity. They could be secretive, moody, and competitive, but mostly they learned from and inspired each other.
Florence's treasure-packed Uffizi Gallery features a room of masterpieces by Sandro Botticelli, who for many people is the quintessential Renaissance painter. He was one of the first of the period who dared to use ancient mythology, playing down its paganism with its innocent-looking maidens. His images stay with you. Who could forget the birth of Venus as she appears fully grown, naked and newborn, standing on a clamshell, protected by the winds and her maiden-in-waiting? Or the allegory of spring in pastel colors, a romantic vision of classical Greece. All things in nature and legend are possible subjects. Next to the Botticelli room are two paintings by a young Leonardo da Vinci, the Wunderkind himself. Here we see his promise in an early painting, the Annunciation, made when he was about 20. The Adoration of the Magi, painted 10 years later, is unfinished but packed with human feeling. For pure beauty and grace, look no further than the exquisite frescoes of Raffaello Sanzio or Raphael. Raphael, born in Urbino, Italy, died at 37 years old. For his relatively short career, Raphael's outpouring of work was phenomenal. His magnificent altarpieces and paintings usually include the Madonna and Child. They sum up a clear purpose in religious art: to inspire devotion and admiration for pure beauty.
The Renaissance in Florence was made possible in part by a grant from the Medici family. Well, actually more than one grant. There was Cosimo, Catherine, Lorenzo the Magnificent. You get the idea. They made their fortunes in banking. They invested in the arts, and they all loved nice things.
Lorenzo's villa says it all. The Medici influence over 15th century Florence is inescapable. In paintings that featured family and acquaintances, in their lavish neo-Greek villas, and in breathtaking gardens and palaces. They commissioned whatever it took to fill their days with the magnificent, the new, in the classical world. Cosimo de' Medici set the family goals based on the tenets of Plato. His grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent was a brilliant scholar and talented poet. The Medici wealth made Florence the cultural hub of Italy, in a way gilding Florentine thirst for power by nurturing the Platonic ideal, to promote beauty, artistic genius, knowledge of the classics, and pride in their city. Michelangelo grew up in Florence, a teenage prodigy, already honing his potential as architect, sculptor, painter, and poet. He lived for 89 years, and his influence on Western art is unparalleled. Michelangelo chiseled out the sublime David, now in the Accademia, the ultimate Renaissance man. Unlike the Davids of Donatello and others, this lad does not grasp a sword or stand over the severed head of Goliath. We gaze at a solitary 14-foot man about to hurl a stone. This marble giant appears to have unrestrained admiration for himself, the individual, and in sheer naked beauty and power, he is absolutely liberated. At the end of his life, 50 years later, Michelangelo told a friend, "I am dying, just as I begin to learn the alphabet of my profession." Awesome indeed.
The 15th century greats had cultivated a playing field for the 16th century greats, for multi-layered Michelangelo, Raphael, Titian, and Leonardo. Leonardo da Vinci's epic talents must have left him dizzy. This painter of the famous Mona Lisa was reputed to be the one who did not finish his work. No matter. Scientist, painter, architect, his brain power still boggles the mind, and his innovative spirit characterizes the High Renaissance.
As we leave Florence, we're taking one more day trip, this time to the nearby town of Vinci, the home of, you guessed it, Leonardo da Vinci. The word genius, used frequently in talk about the Renaissance, is defined as an exceptional natural capacity of intellect, especially as shown in creative and original works in science and art. Perhaps nowhere does the Renaissance ideal and breadth live more than in the legacy of Leonardo da Vinci. His life spanned the mid-1400s to the early 1500s, and his spirit of inquiry soared centuries ahead. His imagined machines were rendered exactly, almost as blueprints. Are you ready for battle, flight, or ocean sports? Leonardo's intellect readied him for anything. Ready for anything, we need no excuse to wend our way to watery, theatrical Venice. Stand in San Marco Square and the Venetian Renaissance surrounds you. Corinthian columns, arches, simple repetition, and classic balance. Buildings overflow with art. Veronese, Giorgione, Titian. And in paintings, the Venetian Renaissance was about color, vivid, big, rich color. In the Campo de' Frari church, Titian's ascension into heaven illustrates the grandeur of his work. Venetians focused on blending colors rather than drawing clear outlines. This new freedom in grand brush strokes and coloring would refresh art workshops across Europe. Titian loved rich drapes and flowing garments. He drew the sensual human figure from all angles and made huge portraits. He became Italy's most venerated portrait artist. Royalty eagerly sat still for Titian, knowing that at least on his canvas, they would become bigger than life. We're heading west toward France's Loire Valley and on to London, England. But first, a stop at Milan in northern Italy. The high-tech, fashion-mad world of Milan bustles around an imposing Gothic cathedral. And tucked away in the small church of Santa Maria delle Grazie is a Renaissance gem, Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. After years of restoration, the famous painting is open again to the public by appointment. Painted on the wall at the far end of the church, the faces of Jesus Christ and his 12 apostles seem dramatically alive, almost like guests at the Sunday service. You can see Leonardo's technique of blurring edges into the background for depth and realism, and this richly detailed painting he finished.
It was a spirit of inquiry and a rebirth, a spreading wave of change that in time created the Renaissance. Over 5 centuries later, we travelers stand in awe of that rebirth. We go looking for the art, architecture, and vitality of Europe's golden age in its timeless places, the cities of Italy and the countryside of France.
The countryside of France. Just say it and you begin to relax, to smile, to plan your next chateau visit or daydream about a hunt. Well, anticipating the hunt was the case with Renaissance royalty and nobility. This is where they headed, to the verdant, slightly hilly, breezy and sunlit Loire Valley, where at every turn in the road they were confronted by a medieval fortress. With royal comrades to impress and money to burn, the high rollers bought up or took over the 12th century fortifications that waited silently to be made over into extravagant 15th century Renaissance chateaux. Originally, they looked like the Chateau Sully-sur-Loire, one of dozens of fortresses in the Loire Valley. Francois I, King of France, was a major renovator of medieval castles. He grew up in this one, the Amboise Chateau, accustomed to the princely life, dancing, festivals, and lively hunting parties. Then he fell in love with Italy. After getting a taste of Italy's Renaissance spirit, Francois brought Leonardo da Vinci himself and other Italian artists to the Loire, luring them to enhance the art and architecture of his many chateaux. Chambord is by far the largest chateau, with more than 400 rooms in elaborate Renaissance style. Reminiscent of Greek stability and 15th century luxury, the acres of structures were built to last. Chenonceau Chateau is also part of Francois' family domain. Visitors can learn about generations of romantic romps and revenge, political betrayals, lavish parties, and the power struggles rampant in this opulent world. Or they can wander quietly, breathing in the glorious Renaissance setting. The dynamics of progress and the desire to excel were epidemic. Eventually, the Renaissance spread like honey throughout Western Europe and England. A 30-minute train ride from London will land you at a favorite retreat of King Henry VIII. Hampton Court Palace has stood on the north bank of the River Thames for more than 500 years, and it's housed famous figures, including 12 English monarchs. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey of York began building the Tudor Palace in 1514, and by the 1520s he had gifted it to an insistent Henry VIII, but Wolsey was indicted for treason anyway. During his time here, Henry managed to find time to remodel. He replaced part of the elaborate Great Hall, and it's said his Tudor kitchen could serve 1,000 meals a day. The Wolsey Room holds some of Europe's finest Renaissance paintings, and the elaborate mazes in the garden are famous.